gives me great pleasure to welcome Commissioner Charles Ramsey to our virtual meeting this year of the Brazilian Fórum for Public Safety. I'm sorry we cannot welcome you in person to our meeting in Brazil this year, but our wonderful staff is going to make this virtual presence seem as real as possible. So,
thank you.
Okay, and this will be, I cannot begin to do justice to Commissioner Ramsey's spectacular biography and career, but by way of introduction, I would like to highlight and emphasize those aspects of his career that are most relevant for our Brazilian public safety audience. His policing career started in his hometown of Chicago, where during 3 decades, he developed innovative policing models, and most notably, the Chicago Alternative Policing Strategy, or CAPS, which introduced community policing models to Chicago and to the country. He was chief of the Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C. From 1998 to 2006. And again, among other reforms, putting emphasis on community relations through the program Policing for Prevention. And as commissioner of the Philadelphia Police in Pennsylvania from 2008 to 2016, he once again focused on reducing crime while building trust with the community. In 2015, he accepted President Obama's invitation to co-chair the Task Force on 21st Century Policing in the wake of rising crime rates and in following the police killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And this would, of course, become a series of police killings of Black boys and men in the following years. Today, Charles Ramsey is chairman of the Philadelphia Commission on Crime and Delinquency at the invitation of Pennsylvania's Governor Tom Wolf. So once again, welcome to our meeting. And now let's get to the substance. To start our conversation, since some versions of community policing have been a constant priority in your career, I'd like to ask how to convince police of its effectiveness. It's not been universally supported by police, either in the US or in Brazil, where it's been tried in many states. Studies in Brazil frequently note that the police feel their work rather than real policing. So how do you make that strategy appealing?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me participate in this event. Let me start off by saying that, you know, when I think about community policing, I can see just how I've evolved over the years. You know, when I was a young policeman in Chicago, in my early years, I had never heard of community policing. And when it began to kind of spread throughout the United States, I had my doubts because I thought it was just soft on crime. It was just about, you know, community relations. It wasn't real policing. And when I got the assignment to create a community policing model for the Chicago Police Department, you know, again, I was still a little skeptical. I knew a bit more about the concept, but how do you operationalize it? How do you actually make it effective so that you not only can develop strong relationships, trust and legitimacy, which is essential in policing, but at the same time have an impact on crime? And what I found was that the two go hand in hand. It's not really it's not an either or proposition. I mean, you do both with a true community policing model. Obviously, you know, people have different opinions about these things, but I've learned that without building relationships, without having true trust and legitimacy in the eyes of the people that we serve, it's very difficult to do anything else in terms of real policing. And this notion that, we're not social workers. Well, excuse me, a lot of what police work is really touches on social work. I mean, who gets called if there's a person going through a mental health crisis? Who gets called? Police. If you're dealing with someone that's got a substance abuse issue, who gets called usually? It's the police, because we're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, holidays included. And, that's who gets called. We learn to go into situations where maybe there's a domestic dispute taking place. Who has to go in there and de-escalate and resolve that issue? And even if, fortunately, in many jurisdictions, you're able to not only resolve it at the moment, you're able to refer them to some specialist that can really provide more long-term support. So there's nothing wrong with doing some degree of social work. I think it's essential to be effective as a police officer and as a police agency.
Okay, thank you. I would like to now ask you about the issue of accountability, which was a major focus of the recommendations of the task force on 21st century policing, which you co-chaired. It's remained as important and controversial as ever in the years since, as the number of deadly police shootings in both the United States and in Brazil, especially of Black youth and men, has increased greatly. Accountability can happen in various ways and at various levels. And so I would like to ask if you can share your thoughts on the most effective and viable ways of increasing police accountability.
Well, I keep going back to one overarching theme I think you'll see throughout this interview, and that is trust and legitimacy. Police have to be held accountable in order to really attain and maintain the trust and of the people that we serve. I mean, police are given an awesome responsibility to enforce laws, uphold people's constitutional rights. I mean, and it also has the authority to actually use force in certain situations, up to and including taking another individual's life. I mean, when you really stop and think about that, there is nothing more serious than that. How can you think for a moment that you should not be held responsible or accountable for your actions? I mean, we have to have a system in place that's fair, because officers are entitled to due process like anyone else. But the reality is they have to be held accountable for their actions. How do you achieve that? Education and training is one way of really starting. Making sure that officers are properly trained, properly equipped. And I don't mean training in the sense of somebody standing in front of a group of police officers and reading verbatim from a directive of some kind. We've started using what we call reality-based training in the States more and more. That is creating scenarios where officers are put into these situations, and what's being tested? Their judgment. How are they resolving this issue? How adept are they at really trying to de-escalate a situation? If they have to resort to force, what kind of force? Is it necessary? Is it reasonable? Is it proportional? So that we begin to train people in a manner that's consistent with what the public expects, quite frankly. And that is that officers, and understanding that officers do have to resort to force, but it's a last resort. And if they do, it's only that's appropriate to deal with that particular situation. In addition to training and education, you have to make sure that you have a process in place for a fair, objective, and reasonably fast investigation of the incident. My bias is that it be done by an outside agency, not by the agency that the officer is from. Again, it doesn't mean that agency is incapable of conducting a thorough investigation, but what about the public perception? You need to have faith in the outcome. I'm also a proponent of oversight, civilian oversight. We work for the people. Having civilian oversight, someone who actually has input on your policies, on your procedures, on your disciplinary process. I mean, those are all critical things that I think you have to have in place to really build that trust and legitimacy in the eyes of the people that we serve. And so accountability is essential. There are ways in which you can achieve that. But I do believe that it's always going to be a challenge in terms of making sure that we're doing what you can to make sure that people really understand the challenges that police officers face out there. They are human beings. Sometimes mistakes are made. The question is whether or not it's an honest mistake that's made, or is this something that really indicates a much larger issue, a much larger problem in terms of that individual officer? One area that I don't want to overlook, and that's recruiting and hiring. We need to make sure that we're bringing people into our ranks that have the right mindset and mentality, personality to be effective police officers in the 21st century. We need people that really do have communication skills, that are able to interact with people, but still have the courage to be able to go in and deal with some of the very dangerous situations that police officers have to deal with. They also have to have another kind of courage, and that is to intervene if they see an officer doing something that's inappropriate, to stop it, to not allow it to continue. And so the complexity of policing is probably more now than ever, to be honest with you. But we need to be able to meet the challenge. And everything is on video now. So, it has a huge impact on people's perception of policing. And we need to understand that, and we need to do our jobs, do it properly, and never forget the fact that as police, we have not just an obligation to arrest people that commit crime. We have an obligation to protect the rights of all people, including those that we arrest.
Because, just to follow up a bit on this, because accountability has been so much in the news in the last year or so, one of the foci has been on the police unions.
Yeah.
As a pushback against many of the accountability measures that police departments want to institute. So can you talk a little about how to deal with the union presence in police departments around the issue of accountability?
Well, let me start by saying I am not anti-union. However, I do believe that unions have grown too powerful in many jurisdictions, and they do have a tremendous amount of influence in terms of what you can do, in terms of a police chief's ability to be able to run a police department, in terms of being able to hold people accountable. And they've gotten far too strong, far too powerful. Now, is it all their fault? No. When you look at city governments, and I'm talking from the perspective of American policing, because that's what I know. Cities have given away management rights left and right, and they've done it for years. And it's time, and now we're paying the price. So when you look at some of the things in contracts, for an example, I've had to fire police officers that have engaged in serious misconduct more than once. In other words, I fired them once, they went to arbitration, they got their jobs back, they did something else that was just as egregious as what they did the first time. I had to fire them again, and just fortunate that I didn't get them back a third time, because in one case I came very close to having that happen. I mean, not everyone is suited for policing, and it may not rise to a criminal offense, but they are suited to serve in policing, and we don't need them. Gotten to a point now where they almost take on the mentality there are no bad cops, and it doesn't matter what you do, they are still going to defend that individual. And again, I'm not against people having solid defense. I mean, everybody is entitled to that, but it does come a time when a person just needs to find another line of work. And it becomes increasingly difficult to be able to manage a department and hold people accountable. And it's not just police. When you look at our prosecutors in many instances. Let's say you have an officer involved shooting. You begin the investigation, but you automatically have to send that over to the district attorney or the state's attorney to see whether or not criminal charges need to be placed. Well, that suspends any administrative investigation because of garrity rules and things of that nature until there's a letter of declination or a decision to move forward with criminal prosecution. I've had situations where it's taken 2 years or more to get a letter of declination or anything out of the district attorney's office. 2 years. It didn't take 2 years to do the 9/11 report. I mean, it's ridiculous. And what does that do? Again, it erodes that trust that we have with community. And so it's the criminal justice system that we need to be looking at. We talk reform, we tend to talk about police reform. We need to look at the entire criminal justice system. And that was one of the very first, in fact, it was the first recommendation we made in the Obama Task Force report, was that a commission needs to be put together to look at the entire criminal justice system. That had not been done since Lyndon Johnson was president in the United States back in the 1960s. I think 1964 is the last time that was done.
Okay. Both the US and Brazil are federal systems in which the primary jurisdiction for the police is at the local level. In the United States, municipal. In Brazil, it's at the state level. Nevertheless, there are various ways, especially in the US, with the interaction of federal and state or municipal local level occurs. And I think it's both positively and negatively. I think positively, perhaps during some administrations in the US, the use of federal consent decrees from the Justice Department was an important tool in encouraging accountability. Doesn't always work in each administration. On the other hand, the transfer of military-style equipment from the Defense Department in recent years to local police departments has led to what many people have been calling the militarization of the police, especially, well, in the US. And so can you talk about this federal-local relationship and when it's positive and when it's problematic?
Well, it's positive in many ways. And I've only worked in big cities, Chicago, DC, and Philadelphia. Most of that federal interaction takes place through task forces that exist. Task force with the FBI, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, for an example, Drug Enforcement Agency, Joint Terrorism Task Force. That's how most of it takes place. Now, there are some cases that you wind up taking federally to federal court, but most of the interaction is really through the task forces. That's invaluable because they can bring to bear resources that you simply, in many instances, don't have at the local level. So it's very positive from that regard. You mentioned consent decrees. When you have an agency that has shown a pattern and practice of abuse of people's rights, improper use of force, things of that nature, take a look at that department, make recommendations, bring it to the federal court. And, the city and the department can easily become under a consent decree. I happen to currently be a member of the monitoring team in both Baltimore, Maryland, and Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm very familiar with that. But there was another way in which a police agency could have an outside look at their operations, and that was called collaborative reform. This current administration that we have here in the States got rid of that. I think that was a mistake, but it was a way in which the Justice Department could come in. I actually asked them to come in to Philadelphia. They take a look at your operations and they make recommendations very similar to what they would do in a consent decree, but the federal courts are not involved. But that's when you're voluntarily trying to make the changes. And sometimes, when you're in an agency, you don't always see the things that you should see because you're so close to it. So having that outside perspective, I think, is invaluable. As far as the 1033 program, which is actually what was used for the federal government to provide some military equipment to police departments, there is some military equipment that I don't believe police officers or police departments necessarily need, but there is some that, yeah, police departments need. And I think we've done a poor job of explaining to the public why you need some of this type of equipment. For an example, in policing, an officer could get dispatched to a call of just a disturbance, maybe some kids loitering on a corner of a street, and some people are disturbed by it, and they call the police. Or you could actually be dispatched to an active shooter. And unfortunately, we've had more than our share of situations that where we've had shootings in schools, we've had them in shopping malls, we've had them in churches, and it's very unfortunate, but it's also a reality. Different types of calls, different responses, but also the tools you'll need to resolve it will be quite different. So I think what's important is having, one, to demonstrate a real need to have a particular piece of equipment. Secondly, you need to be able to demonstrate you have policies, tight policies in place to when that equipment can be deployed, under what circumstances can it be deployed. And you need to be able to show that you have training in place so that police officers are well trained in how and when to use that equipment. Let's use a demonstration as an example. And I'll use one that happened a few years ago where you had an officer involved shooting, very controversial. You had people come out and there was large demonstrations take place. You look at the police response, they had an armored vehicle. They actually had an individual sitting on top of the armored vehicle with a rifle with a scope. I mean, it was a peaceful demonstration. Why would you want to even bring equipment like that out to the scene? There was no riot. There was no need for anything like that. That was totally inappropriate. In fact, that was the incident that really kind of heightened people's awareness about what was going on. And so this whole notion of militarization, and I understand where many are coming from, but I also think there has to be an understanding of the range of responses and responsibilities that police have, and what kind of equipment and what kind of tools is needed to be able to effectively deal with it. And needs to be justified, it needs to be monitored, need to have tight policy, need to have good training. But just to totally eliminate it, I think, is a mistake, because now the city's going to have to buy it, because sometimes you need that equipment. So the question of where does it come from, the federal government for free, or do you pay for it? And believe me, the federal government, if they give you that equipment, they monitor and they audit. They'll come out and check periodically to make sure that you still have it and that it's being utilized. I think in some cases, not every department needs to have some of this equipment. A regional response for some of the smaller agencies would probably be better. But nonetheless, I think there are times when people will need that. Apologize. Sorry.
Okay. I'd like to move on to the question of the new technologies that are available to police today. They can be controversial. For example, body cameras,
Right.
which the task force noted is a complex tool that can have negative effects
Right.
on the relationship between police and communities. And similarly, the use, I think more recently, of facial recognition technologies, controversial for the potential impacts on privacy of individuals.
First of all, if you go back to the President's Task Force report from 2015, we spent a little time talking about body-worn cameras. That was the technology of the moment. But we didn't want to spend too much time when we were discussing this as we were going through our deliberations. And the reason is because today it's body-worn cameras, tomorrow it'll be some other technology that we need to be in a position to address. So what is it about technology in the hands of police that's important? And one of the things that we came to an understanding and a conclusion was really that it's how technology is used by police and make sure that it's used within a constitutional framework, so that whatever that technology is, we take into consideration the impact it's going to have on privacy, on individual rights, and so forth. And those discussions, by the way, need to be had up front, not after you buy it, but before. And you need to have at the table the ACLU, the Bar Association, community organizations, academics, and police professionals having these discussions. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And so there's some technologies that perhaps are not best for police to use at this point in time. And if you are going to use it, then you need to make sure you have the proper policy, training, and safeguards in place so that it's not abused. And so, I think that's the real focus that we need to have when it comes to technology. Technology can be a force multiplier when it comes to dealing with crime and disorder. I am certainly in favor of technology, but I'm in favor of the proper use of technology. Technology that has been proven to work. You raise facial recognition. Facial recognition could be of value, but right now it's not ready for prime time, in my opinion, because it's too many false positives. It doesn't mean that there'll never come a time when it won't be useful, but maybe not right at this moment. The other thing is, even with data, with data that's being collected on a regular basis, it's easy to get into a database, not so easy to get out of the database. And so we're collecting a lot of information. License plate readers, for an example, that go down and they scan vehicles that are parked or moving to see if they're stolen or what have you. It's been a valuable tool. How long do you keep that information in a database, though? Because for every hot car you get, you probably have scanned hundreds of cars, people that aren't doing anything illegal, anything wrong. So having policies in place that, unless there's some association or connection to criminal activity, that's deleted. It's gone. You can't recover it. And so those are safeguards. Those are things that we have to make sure are in place before we start to use any particular technology. And if we don't define that for ourselves, if we don't create that policy, somebody's going to do it for us. And it probably will limit our ability to really leverage that technology. And so I think it's important that we have these discussions, but we bring the right people to the table, that not just be a discussion amongst police chiefs, that we do need to really have serious discussion and debate around this. Technology is all around us. There is no escaping it. Police, no different. But we need to really think about what we're doing, how we're using it, what policies do we have in place, what training we have, and so forth. And then be transparent. Let people in our communities know exactly what it is that we're doing. What is the policy? What is the training? How long do you retain data? And I think if we do that, we can experience the best of both worlds.
And I think our time is coming to a close, but there's one other issue that I would like to raise that I think both countries are faced with. And that is when national leaders advocate for forms of policing that give permission for human rights abuses. It creates the opportunities for these abuses to be practiced countrywide. And for example, permission for a law and order policing when a local police department may not subscribe to that, or permission for flouting gun control measures. And so it's an issue that bothers me, and I'm sure bothers a lot of people, is how do we deal with this disconnect between what's being said at the federal level and what local police want to be able to do.
Earlier we talked about different types of courage. One being, of course, being able to confront an armed individual the other, having the courage to intervene if you see something going on that's not proper, that's not correct. Well, there has to be a courage to ignore and not follow through on orders that really violate people's rights. In the United States, the Constitution doesn't carve out an exception for police. In other words, your constitutional rights are for everyone other than police. You need to understand as a police, these are your rights too. And so, today, maybe it's someone else. And I mean, in the aftermath of 9/11, for an example, you saw efforts to, identify people who, Muslims, for an example, as if, somehow, pay close attention, because we had the terrorist attacks and so forth. You can't do that sort of thing. It's contrary to what our country, the United States, stands for. And I don't care if it's a president of the United States, if it's an attorney general, if it's your mayor, if it's a police chief telling his police officers, if what he's asking them to do is unconstitutional, it unfairly singles out individuals to treat them differently than you would someone else, that's just flat out wrong, and that's not an order you should follow. I mean, it's just not. I go back to something that I talk about quite a bit when I was talking to my police officers. We all take an oath, and the oath is very similar. I mean, some differences, but, we not only take an oath to protect, life, property, and so forth. We also, within that oath of office, is the protection of people's constitutional rights. And when you really stop and think about it, you ask the average police officer, what's the role of police in a democratic society? Most of them will probably, unfortunately, say, enforce the law. First of all, that's a very narrow part of what we do. But what if, just imagine for a moment, if you asked that question and the officer said, to protect the constitutional rights of all people? If that was the first response, would we be having the difficulty and the issues that we're having today as it relates to policing in America? I don't think so. So we've got to push that forward. We got to make sure that people understand that. When we had demonstrations in Philadelphia a few years ago, Occupy Philadelphia, we had a detail that went on for about 3-4 months. Every roll call that we had on every single shift started the same way. We read the First Amendment of the United States Constitution to the men and women there. People have a right to demonstrate. They're not your enemy. They have a right. Can't destroy property and all that, but they have a right to be there. And you need to understand that. We read every single day as a reminder about the constitutional rights that people have. You may not agree with what they stand for. You may not agree with what they're, with a particular cause. That's okay. But your job is to protect their right to be able to exercise that freedom. Because in the United States, I think we take too much for granted. And so, it's a challenging time. It's a challenging climate that we're in. But police as a profession have to stand up and be counted if something is going down a path that's going to lead our democracy in the wrong way.
Thank you so much for that message. And before we end, is there anything beyond the questions that I've posed to you? Is there anything you would like to add to your message?
No, I actively served in policing for 47 years. I started in Chicago. I'm from Chicago, but I began in 1968 as an 18-year-old police cadet. So I've seen a lot of changes over the years, but I still believe in the profession. I still believe in policing. I still believe in people. I still believe that we can, make our society stronger and better. And it's tough. The times we're in right now are incredibly challenging, more challenging than anything I've seen during my time of active service. But we'll come through it. We'll come through it better. We'll come through it stronger. And just keep the faith and keep at it.